This is chapter 21 of Pride and Prejudice. In chapter 19, Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth and she says no. He doesn't understand. Very simple advice that no means no. He insists that she's just trying to flirt with him. Chapter 20 is Mr. Collins getting that explained to him. Mrs. Bennet finds out that Elizabeth says no. She insists that Elizabeth marry him. Mr. Bennet backs up Elizabeth, and so Elizabeth and Mr. Collins marrying is off the table by the end of chapter 20. In early 1800s England, women did not have many avenues for power. As Mrs. Bennet panicked, points out in chapter 20, when Mr. Bennet dies, if his daughters are not married, Mr. Collins can really just kick them out of their house. Although Elizabeth knows that that can happen, she still chooses to say no to Mr. Collins because she does not love him, which shows that she has firm beliefs and sticks by what she believes in. She's also exercising one of the few powers that a woman in early 1800s and before would have, which is the power to say no. So even though women don't always have the greatest social opportunities or don't have many social opportunities or opportunities for work at all, she is exercising one of the few powers reserved for women, which is the ability to say no. So good for her. Chapter 21. The discussion of Mr. Collins' offer was now nearly at an end, and Elizabeth had only to suffer from the uncomfortable feelings necessarily attending it, and occasionally from some peevish allusion of her mother. As for the gentleman himself, his feelings were chiefly expressed not by embarrassment or dejection, or by trying to avoid her, but by stiffness of manner and resentful silence. He scarcely ever spoke to her, and the assiduous attentions which he had been so sensible of himself were transferred for the rest of the day to Miss Lucas, whose civility in listening to him was a seasonable relief to them all, and especially to her friend. The morrow produced no abatement of Mrs. Bennet's ill humor or ill health. Mr. Collins was also in the same state of angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped that his resentment might shorten his visit, but his plan did not appear in the least affected by it. He was always to have gone on Saturday, and to Saturday he still meant to stay. After breakfast the girls walked to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham were returned, and to lament over his absence from the Netherfield ball. He joined them on their entering the town, and attended them to their aunt's, where his regret and vexation and the concern of everybody were well talked over. To Elizabeth, however, he voluntarily acknowledged that the necessity of his absence had been self-imposed. I found, said he, as the time drew near, that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy, that to be in the same room, the same party with him for so many hours together, might be more than I could bear, and that scenes might arise unpleasant to more than myself. She highly approved his forbearance, and they had leisure for a full discussion of it, and for all the commendation which they civilly bestowed on each other, as Wickham and another officer walked back with them to Longbourn, and during the walk he particularly attended to her. His accompanying them was a double advantage. She felt all the compliment it offered to herself, and it was most acceptable as an occasion of introducing him to her father and mother. So Wickham admits that he kept himself away from the Netherfield ball because he didn't want to cause any sort of uncomfortable situation or unpleasantness with Mr. Darcy there, and Elizabeth approves of that. That was a wise choice for him not to go to the party. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield and was opened immediately. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant little hot-pressed paper, well covered with a lady's fair, flowing hand, and Elizabeth saw her sister's countenance change as she read it, and saw her dwelling intently on some particular passages. Jane recollected herself soon, and putting the letter away, tried to join, with her usual cheerfulness, in the general conversation, but Elizabeth felt an anxiety on the subject which drew off her attention even from Wickham, and no sooner had he and his companion taken leave, than a glance from Jane invited her to follow her upstairs. When they had gained their own room, Jane, taking out the letter, said, "This is from Caroline Bingley. What it contains has surprised me a good deal. The whole party have left Netherfield by this time, and are on their way to town, and without any intention of coming back again. You shall hear what she says." So Elizabeth, Wickham walks them back to Longbourn. Elizabeth introduces him to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, and then Jane gets a letter from Caroline Bingley while they're sitting there, and her face kind of changes as she's reading it, and she says that they've all left Netherfield now, and they don't have any plan to come back again. It's concerning. She then read the first sentence aloud, which comprised the information of their having just resolved to follow their brother to town directly, and of their meaning to dine that day in Grosvenor Street, where Mr. Hurst had a house. The next was in these words: I do not pretend to regret anything I shall leave in Hertfordshire except your society, my dearest friend, but we will hope at some future period to enjoy many returns of that delightful intercourse we have known, and in the meanwhile may lessen the pain of separation by a very frequent and most unreserved correspondence. I depend on you for that. To these high-flown expressions, Elizabeth listened with all the insensibility of distrust, and though the suddenness of their removal surprised her, she saw nothing in it really to lament. It was not to be supposed that their absence from Netherfield would prevent Mr. Bingley's being there, and as to the loss of their society, she was persuaded that Jane must soon cease to regard it in the enjoyment of his. So Elizabeth says, oh well, that doesn't matter. Bingley's still going to be around. It is unlucky, said she, after a short pause, that you should not be able to see your friends before they leave the country, but we may not hope that the period of future happiness to which Miss Bingley looks forward may arrive earlier than she is aware, and that the delightful intercourse you have known as friends will be renewed with yet greater satisfaction as sisters. Mr. Bingley will not be detained in London by them. So Elizabeth again says, oh well, but hopefully you're going to marry him and then you'll get to hang out with Caroline again, and, he's not going to be stuck in London forever. Caroline decidedly says that none of the party will return into Hertfordshire this winter. I will read it to you. When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days. But as we are certain it cannot be so, and at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town he will be in no hurry to leave it again, we have determined on following him thither, that he may not be obliged to spend his vacant hours in a comfortless hotel. Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. I wish I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one in the crowd, but of that I despair. I sincerely hope your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties which that season generally brings, and that your beaux will be so numerous as to prevent your feeling the loss of the 3 of whom we shall deprive you. It is evident by this, added Jane, that he comes back no more this winter. So Caroline says, oh, he's not coming back, and I hope you have a nice Christmas, and that it's great, and that you have other potential suitors and husbands who come around to take up for us taking some of the men away, to make up for us taking some of the men away. It is only evident that Miss Bingley does not mean he should. Why will you think so? It must be his own doing. He is his own master. But now you will know all. I will read you the passage which particularly hurts me. I will have no reserves from you. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and to confess the truth, we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare to entertain of her being hereafter our sister. I do not know whether I ever before mentioned to you my feelings on this subject, but I will not leave the country without confiding them, and I trust you will not esteem them unreasonable. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunity now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. Her relations all wish the connection as much as his own, and his sister's partiality is not misleading me, I think, when I call Charles most capable of engaging any woman's heart. With all these circumstances to favor an attachment, and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many? What think you of this sentence, my dear Lizzie? Said Jane as she finished it. Is it not clear enough? Does she not expressly declare that Caroline neither expects nor wishes me to be her sister, and that she is perfectly convinced of her brother's indifference, and that if she suspects the nature of my feelings for him, she means, most kindly, to put me on my guard? Can there be any other opinion on the subject? So according to Caroline Bingley's letter, when they get into town, they're going to meet up with Georgiana Darcy, who, oh, by the way, everyone is hoping will marry Mr. Bingley, and Caroline is so excited to see her again, and apparently Mr. Bingley also likes Georgiana Darcy. Also note that Jane, being Jane Bennet and really nice to everyone, assumes that Caroline means this, quote, most kindly. Yes, there can, for mine is totally different. Will you hear it? Most willingly. You shall have it in a few words. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in the hope of keeping him there and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you. So Elizabeth is being very logical and reasonable about this and says she's just trying to stop you from marrying him. She wants him to marry Miss Darcy. That's just what she's doing. It's not true. Jane shook her head. Indeed, Jane, you ought to believe me. No one who has ever seen you together can doubt his affection. Miss Bingley, I am sure, cannot. She is not such a simpleton. Could she have seen half as much love in Mr. Darcy for herself, she would have ordered her wedding clothes. But the case is this, we are not rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is the more anxious to get Miss Darcy for her brother from the notion that when there has been one intermarriage, she may have less trouble in achieving the second, in which there is certainly some ingenuity, and I dare say it would succeed if Mr. Burr were out of the way. So Elizabeth says, listen, that's a load of baloney. She just wants Georgiana Darcy to marry Bingley so that it'll be easier for her to marry Mr. Darcy. But my dearest Jane, you cannot seriously imagine that because Miss Bingley tells you her brother greatly admires Miss Darcy, he is in the smallest degree less sensible of your merit than when he took leave of you on Tuesday, or that it will be in her power to persuade him that, instead of being in love with you, he is very much in love with her friend. Elizabeth says, even if some of that were true, Caroline is not going to be able to stop Bingley from liking you. It's very clear that he does have real feelings for you. If we thought alike of Miss Bingley, replied Jane, your representation of all this might make me quite easy. But I know the foundation is unjust. Caroline is incapable of willfully deceiving anyone, and all that I can hope in this case is that she is deceived herself. That is right. You could not have started a more happy idea, since you will not take comfort in mine. Believe her to be deceived by all means. You have now done your duty by her, and must fret no longer. So Jane says, well, the only thing I could take comfort from is that Caroline has to be misled somehow or confused. Elizabeth says, okay, Jane, if that's the only thing that will give you comfort, fine, since you won't listen to my ideas. But my dear sister, can I be happy, even supposing the best, in accepting a man whose sisters and friends are all wishing him to marry elsewhere? So Jane says, can I actually ever be happy with Mr. Bingley if his sisters and his friends don't want him to marry me? You must decide for yourself, said Elizabeth. And if upon mature deliberation you find that the misery of disobliging his two sisters is more than equivalent to the happiness of being his wife, I advise you by all means to refuse him. So Elizabeth is being kind of funny with that, but also pretty serious. She says, if you really think that it would make you more unhappy to annoy his sisters than to be Mr. Bingley's wife and marry him, then fine, don't marry him. How can you talk so? Said Jane, faintly smiling. You must know that though I should be exceedingly grieved at their disapprobation, I could not hesitate. I did not think you would, and that being the case, I cannot consider your situation with much compassion. But if he returns no more this winter, my choice will never be required. 1,000 things may arise in 6 months. The idea of his returning no more Elizabeth treated with the utmost contempt. It appeared to her merely the suggestion of Caroline's interested wishes, and she could not for a moment suppose that those wishes, however openly or artfully spoken, could influence a young man so totally independent of everyone. So Elizabeth knows that Mr. Bingley controls his own destiny, and he doesn't need to listen to Caroline's persuasions, so Elizabeth is not seriously concerned. She represented to her sister as forcibly as possible what she felt on the subject, and had soon the pleasure of seeing its happy effect. Jane's temper was not desponding, and she was gradually led to hope, though the diffidence of affection sometimes overcame the hope, that Bingley would return to Netherfield and answer every wish of her heart. They agreed that Mrs. Bennet should only hear of the departure of the family without being alarmed on the score of the gentleman's conduct. But even this partial communication gave her a great deal of concern, and she bewailed it as exceedingly unlucky the ladies should happen to go away just as they were all getting so intimate together. After lamenting it, however, at some length, she had the consolation of thinking that Mr. Bingley would be soon down again, and soon dining at Longbourn, and the conclusion of all was the comfortable declaration that, though he had been invited only to a family dinner, she would take care to have 2 full courses. So Elizabeth and Jane, probably wisely, decide that they're just going to tell Mrs. Bennet that the ladies have left Netherfield and, Mr. Bingley is gone to London for a little bit. They don't mention that he may never be back. They don't mention anything about him possibly being interested in Georgiana Darcy. None of that is mentioned to Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet still frets a little bit, but then says that's okay. When he's back, we have dinner. There's going to be 2 full courses, and it's going to be great. And that is the end of chapter 21.